Now, as some countries like the United States and Israel have managed to vaccinate a significant proportion of their population, the situation is very different in much of the rest of the world. In many low-income nations, less than 1% of the population has received a single dose of vaccine, which means it will take longer for the pandemic to end, and also more variants will emerge during this time. Now, COVAX, a collaboration of WHO, Vaccine Alliance and Gavi, was meant to address this inequity by providing doses to poorer countries. But so far, they have faltered. To talk more about the situation and the challenges facing the world, we're now joined by Professor Lawrence Gostin, a professor at Georgetown University and also director, World Health Organization Collaborating Center on Public Health Law and Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor, on the show. What is your view of COVAX? And now it's being talked about how, it has kind of failed. It was meant to help countries and meant to address vaccine inequity.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that COVAX has failed, but I think COVAX certainly has not lived up to expectations. I want to begin by saying that, COVAX was a, truly inspirational initiative from the World Health Organization, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI. And I have great hopes that in future it's going to succeed and that it will remain a permanent facility after COVID-19 to get us through all of the unconscionable equity problems that we've seen during COVID-19. But it has not achieved its results. It promised by the end of this year to vaccinate 20% of all lower income country populations. It's nowhere near on track for doing that, and there are many countries that have barely even begun vaccinating their populations, and even the 20% target is really insufficient because I know that the European Union and North America, many other countries of high income would never accept the 20% rate of vaccination by 2022. And so we have to do a lot better in global equity.
Right. And Professor Gostin, what about vaccine manufacturers? There was all this talk of sharing intellectual property and creating more manufacturing units around the world.
Well, very, very little, unfortunately. That is the solution, absolutely the solution. I mean, the United States or the European Union or the UK can be highly philanthropic, and they think, oh, I'm giving charity, I'm giving a dose to India or Brazil or to sub-Saharan Africa. But, a dose of the vaccine might save one life. But if you actually transfer the technology and allow countries to manufacture their own vaccines, you save a country, you save a world. And so that's clearly the answer going forward, not just for this pandemic, but it's the really crucial lesson learned for the future, which is that we have to abandon intellectual property rights. This was a proposal that India and South Africa had put forward before the World Trade Organization, and it still hasn't succeeded, and it probably won't because it's been blocked by the European Union, even though President Biden came along and supported it ultimately. But beyond waiving intellectual property rights so that companies like Serum Institute don't have to worry about lawsuits, we also need to transfer technology. We actually share trade secrets so that we develop the know-how for messenger RNA and other innovative vaccine technologies.
All right, now changing tracks a little bit, what about the origins of the coronavirus pandemic? Do you think we'll ever really know? The US is investigating, but will these investigations yield anything given that China has deflected any sort of the theories floating around like the lab leak suggestions?
Yeah, the very, very sad truth is that the world is never really going to fully know the origins of SARS-CoV-2. And that is, a human failure, a human catastrophe. And it really is solely because one country, China, has not cooperated with the international community and the World Health Organization to make it possible. You know, there are currently two theories that prevail concerning the origins. The first one is by far the most likely, that it was a naturally occurring zoonotic spillover from an animal to a human, and that the virus probably is circulating somewhere in southern China and may have found its way to the Wuhan wet market. But there's also another theory that it was a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The truth is that we spent most of the time complaining that we don't have cooperation on the lab leak, and that absolutely is true. We haven't had that cooperation. We have not had an independent, thorough, rigorous investigation into the lab leak.
Right. Professor, also, if we talk about the vaccination challenge, it's also made more difficult because of all these emerging variants. We're just talking about the Delta plus variant that's emerged and, you know, questions over the effectiveness of the vaccines against these new variants.
It is, and that's why, you know, it connects with the questions you were asking me earlier. Because, you know, if we have been able to vaccinate large swaths of the world's population, we would not be seeing these variants. We're seeing them particularly because countries, if I might even say smug, like the United States or the European Union or the UK, that are doing quite nicely. You know, you go to the streets of Washington, D.C. or New York, and you'd think, well, you'd call the pandemic in past tense, but it's not. And we think we're escaping the variants, but we're not, because as long as you have surging cases around the world, we're going to develop more and more mutations. They're going to become more and more worrying. Right now, fortunately, even with the Delta or the Delta plus variants, most of the world's vaccines hold up very well. But we could see a scenario where we have a variant that escapes vaccines. And that would be a gross tragedy, not just for low and middle income countries, but for high income countries. It would come back to bite us. So it's in all of our national interests, high income countries, you know, middle and low, to come together, vaccinate as many people as we can, to get to the end of this pandemic. It's within our capabilities to do that.
All right, Professor Gostin, thank you so much for joining us here on NDTV.